So one day, a young Hasid, who devoted his life to studying the religious texts of our people, closes his Talmud, goes out into the town square and cries out, "What is the meaning of life? I cannot go any further. I cannot study any longer. I cannot study a sugya, a passage of verse, until I know the meaning of life." Other Hasidim come out to him and try to calm him down, have him return to his Talmud, but to no avail. So they suggest he goes and visits the Rebbe, who's a few towns away. He agrees and leaves immediately. When he finally goes in to see the Rebbe, he says, "Rebbe, what is the meaning of life? I cannot go any further. I cannot study any more text until I know what is the meaning of life." The Rebbe rises from his chair, walks across the room, looks over the young man, and slaps him. "Why, Rebbe? Why do you slap me? All I did was ask, what is the meaning of life?" "You fool," says the Rebbe. "You asked such a good question. Why exchange it for an answer? It's answers which divide us and questions which unite us." I love this story. I love it because I've seen the difference questions can make. I've seen it change lives and I've seen it change organizations. Its questions changed my career path at one point. I was working in my mid-20s in a large financial institution. And one day I was managing a team. My boss decided to add someone to my team, but I didn't interview him, so I met him the first day that he joined us. He came into my office and he said, very nicely, mind you, very nicely, "I only work 9 to 5. I care more about my family. I work to live and I don't live to work." Now, mind you, he was talking to someone who was a complete workaholic. Now, when he left, I was really a little bit dumbstruck, but I also started thinking about how much can we expect of him? How much is he going to contribute to this team? But then I started having some very different questions arise. How do we get the best of people while also contributing to them and have them grow? How do we create workplaces where people thrive and then organizations thrive? You know, there's been a lot of studies that show that happy employees are productive employees, and there's a lot of work being done around this whole area of employee engagement. Well, that question wasn't one I could answer right away. For some time, I certainly thought about it in relation to how I was managing my team, but eventually I saw other opportunities and I began to move into consulting. And I've spent most of my career as a business consultant. Now, as a consultant, we ask lots of questions, and we're not alone. Doctors and lawyers and therapists and scientists and many others ask questions, and maybe you are thinking about all the questions you need to ask to get your work done. But honestly, as consultants, they pay us the big bucks, not for our questions, but for our answers, for our solutions. And I think they have this wrong. The value we bring is the questions we ask and the questions we help them to ask. And in that's where results get better and impact happens. Now, we as Jews have this incredible guide for questions, the Talmud. Now, I am no Talmud scholar. When I was younger, my whole idea of Talmud, I learned from Yentl. And it also didn't help that I had no Hebrew background. I learned Hebrew as an adult in an 8-week course, 6 weeks of which I missed because I was traveling for business. But I did my homework and I learned my Aleph Bet, and you know, that made me very happy. Fast forward a few years, and in 2014, I began to actually study Talmud. I study Talmud now in the S&M Beit Midrash. Now get your mind out of the gutter. We may have studied some texts about sex, but S&M stands for 2 of the hottest organizations in Chicago. The S is for Svara, a yeshiva led by Rabbi B'nai Lappi, and the M is for Mishkan Chicago, the community that I'm part of, led by Rabbi Lizzie Heinemann. In the S&M Beit Midrash, we study Talmud in the original Hebrew Aramaic with no translation. And let me tell you, that first few classes was among the hardest things I've ever did. My head hurt. I had fear in my body from my head to my toe, and I felt inadequate, and these are not my favorite feelings. Something started happening around the second or third class. With the support of my Havruta, my study partner, and my teachers, I began to focus more on what I could do rather than what I couldn't. And I began to see something about the Talmud. It was filled with questions. Questions the rabbis asked, questions our teachers asked, and questions we were asking ourselves as we were translating text and looking for its meaning. Now, maybe because I always have my business hat on, I began to see that the Talmud could really inform us in how we work in our organizations. Now, when we meet somebody new or we enter a new situation, we ask lots of questions. It's very easy to do that. We don't have any expectation of knowing. But when we're faced in organizations with problems, with issues, with even opportunities, we are more likely to go to answers. It's just the way it is. And by the way, I love answers. But sometimes going to answers without some thoughtful consideration isn't the best way to do it. And in fact, I always think like, if we have a complex situation, if we have a big opportunity, why do we think one question is going to take us to the answer that we seek? I was on the board of a nonprofit organization, and over 2 meetings, we had the same issue on the agenda. That's not unusual for a young organization, especially one where we're dealing with those demands from, we don't have that many resources, we've got a lot of demand for our work, we have to balance the saying no, saying yes, saying no situation. And the first time it came to us, we had discussion, we then came to a solution we thought was great, but then the executive director came back and it was not workable. Okay, second meeting we did the same, but when it came back to the third meeting, we couldn't do the same thing. So we did something different. We stepped back and we brainstormed questions, just like you brainstorm answers. The only thing is, there's only a few questions you're not allowed to ask, like, why didn't you? Why can't you? Those judgy questions, I like to call them. And but we spent 5 minutes, literally 5 minutes, and for the first 2 minutes we asked questions that were obvious or questions we'd asked before. But then something happened and we started asking much different questions. So much so that we filled pages with questions. When we got done, we looked and we saw some questions that were much better. It was like taking something and just turning it slightly allowed us to see it very differently. And we answered it and it never came back again. Now, the rabbis of the Talmud give us many ways to ask questions. And in fact, when they introduce a new topic, it's almost like they're brainstorming questions. So, we all know we're supposed to recite the Shema. And the rabbis start asking, what time of day do we recite the Shema? What time in the morning? What time in the evening? Do we recite the Shema sitting or standing or lying? Many questions that we're asked. The other thing that is frequently happening in the Talmud is there's a question asked, an answer, and then another question asked. Now, what that allows us, it allows us to look deeply at something, explore it, be critical, but then turns us on our head, has us look again from a new lens. It's like inhabiting a mindset and then needing to inhabit another. Now, in the organizations I've been part of, both inside and as a consultant, mindsets can get us in trouble because we can get blind to our mindsets and we don't see and we get stuck around conversations. And what I find can happen is the questions we ask are questions that come from that place of advocating for our position and our point of view rather than questions of inquiry. Well, I know this all too well because it happens often in conflict. And I had a conflict once in my career that was a big one. So big that this person and I, who at the time was my boss, but we'd also become friends, we didn't speak for 6 years after this. We were working on a project, we had a disagreement. It's really unimportant what it was. We had a disagreement. We ended up dealing with it from a client standpoint, but our relationship was a big mess. In fact, we even did, active listening, but ours looked something like this. I hear you say this, but I think the same thing. And then the other person, she would say, I hear you say this, but I think the same thing. And it just took us in this big circular place that never solved it. But then the questions we started thinking about, like, what do we want to have happen here? How do I have you be successful? How do we both be successful? Those are the things that could lead to our solving this issue. Now, okay, 6 years go by before we got to that place. But in that 6 years, the cost was big. The cost to our organization, believe me, we were not our most productive self. But also the cost to us, because during that 6 years, I missed her wedding. She got married and I wasn't there, and I will never be able to be at this moment that for her was one of the happiest of her life. But our cost to organizations, when we have conflict, when we have solutions that don't really work, are pretty big. So as I was preparing for this talk, remember, not a Talmud scholar, I had to speak to Talmud scholars and people that know a lot more than me. And one day I was in a room with two of my teachers, and we were talking about the Talmud and questions. All of a sudden, I was not in this conversation. They were talking about things I was not even able to contribute to, but something magical was happening. We went from something that started intellectual to something that changed the whole mood of the room. There was excitement and joy and fun. And when it all finished, I was like, thank you for the stuff I'm going to include in my talk, but how do we do more of this in our organizations? How do we create these moments, not that once a year when we're having a retreat, but more often? Now, there's a recent study that came out from the Bridgespan Group, who's a nonprofit consultancy, and the Rockefeller Foundation. So the Bridgespan Group and the Rockefeller Foundation, they study what they call innovation aspiration. What they found is most nonprofits wanted to and felt that it was important to innovate, but very few, in fact, were innovating or had the capacity to innovate. This is a big gap. Now, they found that those who were innovating, there were a few things that they all had in common, and one of them was a culture of curiosity. Hey, makes a lot of sense, curiosity. Have you ever asked the question, what happened here? Every parent in the room, I know you're shaking your heads, because we've all asked that, especially when something looks not right. What happened here could be asked in two ways. It could be asked like, what happened here? I'm getting ready to accuse you, but I'll give you a second to respond. Or, what happened here? Like, I really am curious. I don't know what you've done, and I really want to know. They create very different responses. What happened here when we ask with accusation will almost always be answered with defensiveness, but you'll also find you will look back at the past. When we ask what happened here with curiosity, we look forward. We look to the future. The rabbis of the Talmud, I believe, know this because of all the questions that they asked. And they model this in so many ways. They think deeply, and they have us think deeply. See, that's the point. Questions aren't just about the questions. It's the thinking that matters. The time to reflect. And it's really hard in our organizations today to balance the needs and demands we have with the time to reflect. But I invite us to be inspired by the Talmud, to ask more questions, lots more questions, not just one or two more, but take the time, maybe even try brainstorming. It's really fun. And new questions lead to new innovations, new ideas, new thinking. Ask bigger questions, questions that don't need an answer right away, that you can sit with and even be uncomfortable with, but allow to be. Those questions lead to breakthroughs. And also, let's create cultures of curiosity in our organizations. Let's have more fun. Let's have more joy, and let's create excitement. Now, asking questions takes courage, but I want to remind us that answers divide us and questions unite us. Thank you very much.